Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar for Digital Inclusion in Action project. My name is Sigrid Jessen, and I am a research fellow here at Nordregio Research Institute in Stockholm. I'm also the project leader of the Digital Inclusion in Action project. We in the team have been looking so much forward to this day, and we're so happy to see so many online on this January morning. The goal of this webinar today is to launch two of the first publication of the Digital Inclusion Research Project, namely a policy report on the national digital inclusion initiatives in the Nordic and Baltic countries, and a discussion paper on the monitoring practices in the Nordic and Baltic countries regarding digital inclusion. For the next hour, the plan is that we first will introduce the policy report. Then I will give the word to our project partners from Digital Europe, Lasse and Louise, who will present their discussion paper, and then the webinar will end with a Q&A. Also here today is my brilliant co-worker Maja, who is also the co-author of the policy report, but she has also promised to act as a moderator during this webinar. We would really love to encourage you to stay engaged during the webinar and ask questions in the chat function of this webinar. And then Maja will then bring the questions up in the end during the Q&A session. Just to let you know, the webinar is recorded, and after the webinar, we will distribute the slides and the recording. As I just said, the idea of this presentation is to briefly go through our policy report and then move on to the discussion paper. And then we'll end up with a Q&A where hopefully you have a lot of great questions and hopefully we will provide some great answers. Before that we really start on this introduction to the different publications, I just want to give a brief introduction to our project, Digital Inclusion in Action. And maybe a good starting point is to discuss why is it that digital inclusion is important in the Nordic and Baltic countries. We are basing our argument in what we call the Nordic and Baltic paradox, which is that on one hand, the Nordic and Baltic countries are among the most highly digitalized countries in Europe. On the other hand, we can also see that this increasing digitalization of society is also causing more and more parts of everyday life to require digital skills and tools to participate. This risk of digital exclusion will then further risk increasing digital different inequalities by hindering job and educational opportunities, civic participation in overall society, access to healthcare, economic activities, and also further risk the increasing risk of social isolation. So what is it we do in the Digital Inclusion in Action project? In the Digital Inclusion in Action project, we are conducting research in the Nordic and Baltic societies, also including Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Åland, on the topic of digital inclusion and how it's shaped and formed in this region. The project is building on the Ministerial Declaration Digital North 2.0. It's a 2-year project running from October 2022 to October 2024. It's funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers, and more specifically, the Ministerial Council of Digitalization, MR Digital. In the project, we have 3 project partners, us from the Nordregio Research Institute in Stockholm, which you can also see here on the picture. We also partner up with the consultancy consortium Digital Europe, who are also present here today and who will present their work on the discussion paper. And then we're also working together with Nordic Welfare Center. We are having a range of different activities in the projects, which today we only have time to show a few of them. But we're also working together with the Nordic and Baltic collaboration on electronic IDs, where we are focusing on electronic ID rollout in the Faroe Islands, Åland, and Greenland. We're also conducting a mapping of civil society actors across the Nordic and Baltic societies. We're also developing a conceptual framework to understand indicator mapping for digital inclusion in Nordic and Baltic region. And then we are also conducting different analysis of political initiatives, as we will also talk about today. The project aim is to contribute to inclusive digital transition in the Nordic and Baltic societies by promoting collaboration, dialogue, and knowledge sharing between practitioners and policymakers in the 11 Nordic and Baltic societies. We have 4 main objectives of the Digital Inclusion Action Project, which is first, to develop a clear understanding of the key aspects that make up digital inclusion in the Nordic Baltic region, including the potential effects of these aspects on different societal groups. 2, to create opportunities for engagement, collaboration, and knowledge sharing related to digital inclusion between actors from different Nordic and Baltic countries and regions. 3, to increase understanding of current policies and initiatives that address digital inclusion in the countries at the national, regional, and local levels. And 4th, to establish a framework that can enable Nordic and Baltic collaboration on monitoring digital inclusion. And while we today will touch upon several of these key objectives, there's the last 2 that is the main focus of today. Today, we do this by launching 2 of the first deliveries of the projects, which is a policy report titled National Digital Inclusion Initiatives in the Nordic and Baltic Countries, which is co-authored by my co-workers and colleagues, Nicola Wendt Lucas and Maja Brynteson and myself. And then we will also launch the discussion paper by Digital Europe on monitoring digital inclusion in the Nordic and Baltic region, which is authored by, as I said, Digital Europe, and more precisely, Lasse, Wulff, Andersen, and Louise, Palludan, Kampmann. So, first things first, our policy report that I would like to give a brief introduction to today. I will not be able to provide all the details of the publication, but you're more than welcome to. I hope that you will read the publication afterwards. The main aim of the publication is to analyze national policies and initiatives in the Nordic and Baltic region regarding digital inclusion. We'll try to understand how different policies are defining digital inclusion in these policies. We will discuss whether or not they are mentioning practices for monitoring digital inclusion. This is also important to note that this is a report that can be seen as a continuation of a pre-started concluded in 2021, which is entitled Monitoring Digital Inclusion in the Nordic and Baltic region. So, in this policy report, what is it then we are doing? We are taking point of departure in a critical discourse analysis framework, where we are taking a 3-phase approach. We will start out by defining the project's outlook based on previous literature. This is then leading to us identifying 3 lead questions, being: is digital exclusion discussed in the policy? Is digital exclusion defined in the policy? And does the policy list digital inclusion and exclusion indicators that are being monitored in the policy? This second phase then resulted in an identification of 34 policies in total, where 19 of these policies have been published since the pre-study, meaning that they have been published in the last 2 years. The third phase of the project, or the policy report, is then to evaluate the policies using these lead questions and the different 15 different barriers to digital inclusion, where we will then manually code the different engagement levels of the policies. And what is it then we find? We find, first of all, a substantial increase across the Nordic and Baltic region in terms of policy initiatives regarding digital inclusion. This is, among other things, evident by the 19 new strategies in just under 2 years being published across the region. It's also evident by the fact that this report hasn't been able to incorporate all the initiatives that are currently happening, because several of new policies are on the way and is in currently political and public consideration. It's important also to know that these policies differ tremendously, both in terms of concreteness regarding the problems, groups, and solutions, but also in terms of how many policies the different countries are actually publishing in these years. Okay, then regarding definitions, what is it then we see? We can see, first of all, that very few of the countries are actually managing to provide concrete definitions on what is it we mean when we are talking about digital inclusion. However, despite this lack of concrete definitions, we can also see indications of similar understanding across the different Nordic and Baltic countries. This is, among other things, clear in the sense that we can see that digital inclusion is very high on the political agenda throughout the most part of the Nordic and Baltic region. We can also see that the justification of why is it actually we need these sorts of policies is linked to an argument of social justice and social inclusion. Regarding different approaches in the Nordic and Baltic countries regarding the policies on digital inclusion, we can see that to a large extent, and this is not to generalize, and more nuances will also be clear in the publication, but to a large extent, we can see that the main approach to digital inclusion in the policies is that digital inclusion is largely situational. This is, among other things, meaning that different groups are experiencing digital inclusion in different ways. We can see in the policies that throughout the Nordic and Baltic region, the main focus of the policies have been on people with disabilities and older adults. However, we can also see that some policies are targeting immigrants, females, younger adults, and lower income and lower education individuals. Most of these policies managed to identify very unique and context-specific problems for very specific groups, and then also provide specific solutions for these groups. However, this is also something that's making digital inclusion overall in society quite difficult and complex, and also making quick fixes difficult and causing them to involve a large range of societal actors. All right, the key takeaways from this very brief introduction to the policy report is that we can see that there's an increased attention to digital inclusion in the Nordic and Baltic region, with more than 19 new published political strategies in the past 2 years and more on the way. Currently, there's no common definition in place across the Nordic Baltic region, and we can also see very few attempts at the national level to actually provide different definitions for digital inclusion. generally, we can see that there's a similar framing of digital inclusion, taking a core point of departure in social inclusion arguments. However, we can also see differences across the Nordic and Baltic countries, which is then highlighting again some very specific challenges that each country is facing. We can see in general that there's a large consensus across the Nordic and Baltic region in the identification of who is the groups that are most at risk, or who is the groups that we are trying to target and provide solutions for, which mainly is older adults and people with disabilities. However, many other subgroups are also being mentioned across the different policies. And finally, we will then argue that more harmonized monitoring is required in order to develop more in-depth studies and provide more evidence-based policies. And this was all for the first very brief introduction to the policy report. As I also mentioned, it's a large report. Please check it out, because there's many details in the report that I would not be able to provide information on in this short time span, but please check it out afterwards. And before we then move on and give the floor to Lasse and Louise from Digital Europe, I would just like to ask Maja if we have already now received some questions from the Q&A function before we move on to the next part.
Yes, we've actually received a couple of questions already. Okay. And I just want to remind you again that you in the audience can send more questions in the chat throughout this webinar, and we will answer them throughout this webinar. And if you have any other questions, you can reach out to us later on. But I got one question that is, what surprised you the most when writing this report?
I think maybe I think that would probably be the sheer amount of attention that this has received. We are talking about a study that, while we're also focusing on policies that have been published prior to this main time period of where we are focusing on the 2 last years, the main focus has been the last 2 years, and we can see 19 new publications across the region, which is a substantial increase, at least in the sense. And while there is, of course, differences across the Nordic and Baltic region on the level of concreteness and the level of engagement in the policies, we can conclude that the Nordic and Baltic region is taking this very seriously from a political standpoint, and something that I personally also think that we should also further in the future, and maintain as a key focus point in the future. So, but as Maja said, please ask more questions in the chat function, and then we will have a longer Q&A in the end. So, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Lasse and Louise, who will provide, who are representing the consultancy consortium Digital Europe. They are also our partner in this project, and they have been working on a discussion paper on monitoring digital inclusion throughout the Nordic and Baltic region. So the floor is yours, Lasse and Louise.
Thank you very much. I'll start. Lasse is going to take over at some point throughout these slides. And on behalf of both of us, I would like to say thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to talk about this discussion paper that we have done as part of this overall project. Lasse and I have been working with digital inclusion for a number of years in different ways. and we are actually representing two different companies, Next Puzzle and Cobras Consulting, and together we have established this consortium that we call Digital Europe. And we are also looking very much forward to your questions when we have finished this presentation. So if we move on to the agenda, you will see that we have four main items on the agenda. Firstly, we would like to go through the objective and content of the discussion paper. Secondly, the understandings of the concept of digital inclusion that we find in the Nordic Baltic countries and in the EU. Then we will present the overall findings from our work, and lastly, we will introduce our suggestions and recommendations on digital inclusion that we have come up with in this discussion paper. But why is this topic even important? Sigrid also touched upon that question, and we agree with Sigrid that it is important because today significant aspects of our lives have moved to digital channels, including our interactions with public authorities. However, not everyone is able to participate in the shift towards increased digitalization, and that is, as you are well aware of, resulting in a range of challenges. The political will to address the challenge of citizens who have trouble participating in digital society often depends on the existence of a documented problem and the magnitude of that problem. That is what we often call evidence-based policymaking. So you could say that we, and particularly politicians, are more likely to start working on solving problems that are documented than problems that are just articulated. And that is the reason why monitoring the issue of digital inclusion is important to provide the attention necessary for political prioritization. So the objective of this paper is to discuss how monitoring is performed in the Nordic and Baltic countries, as well as at the EU level. And the discussion will include observations regarding the pros and cons of enhancing collaboration between the examined countries and the EU in terms of measuring the policy field. So the content is introduction, and then we get to the understanding of digital inclusion, including scoping digital inclusion and definition of digital inclusion at the European level and also among the Nordic and Baltic countries. Then we will move on to current monitoring of digital inclusion. Oh no, that was a bit too fast, Lasse, sorry. Including monitoring at the EU level, which we know as DESI, the DESI framework. What elements of what we call digital inclusion are DESI measuring, and what is the monitoring going on in the Nordic Baltic countries. Then we will get to advocating for comprehensive monitoring, and lastly, considerations for next steps, which will be including a number of suggestions and recommendations. So, understanding digital inclusion. Only very few of the Nordic and Baltic countries have specific and official definitions of digital inclusion, and there is no common definition across the countries. However, the Nordic and Baltic countries do have a shared understanding of certain elements of digital inclusion, especially concerning various access and capability barriers, for example, skills, and specific groups of people at risk of digital exclusion, such as the elderly and people with disabilities, etc., just like Sigrid just told us about. And that means that we can therefore use this basic conceptual approach that we did in this model for understanding digital inclusion. But while there are variations between the European concept of digital inclusion and that of the Nordic and Baltic countries, we do find that the differences are not profound and do not pose a substantial obstacle to fostering a closer collaboration on formulation of definitions and methodologies for measuring digital inclusion. So, in other words, when comparing to the approach from the EU, we actually do see a similar understanding to a large degree. So, Professor Massimo Ragnetta, maybe you've heard of him. He's from university, Northumbria University, Newcastle, UK. And we included him in this discussion paper because we find that he has some interesting arguments about new technologies and the role that new technologies might play in this field of interest for us. New technologies are rapidly being introduced in most countries' public sectors, particularly artificial intelligence, known as AI, is gaining prevalence. But neither the Nordic Baltic countries nor the EU have specifically included AI and its significance in their understanding of digital inclusion. Professor Ragnetta argues that a new dimension of digital exclusion is emerging, shaped by the spread of language models, AI, algorithms, and other sophisticated digital technologies. So he argues that technologies are not neutral. Instead, they are influenced by their creators, who encode their biases into the technologies. Thus, the algorithms that are created to reshape many aspects of our lives carry the imprint of their designers, which may continue existing societal biases. An example could be AI trained on large data sets that might reflect historical inequalities and thereby maintains under or misrepresentation of marginalized groups. Such aspects we find are new compared to the way in which most countries and also international organizations is working with defining digital inclusion today. But they might be important considerations that look ahead to the various forms that digital inclusion might take in the future, and maybe a way for political entities to prepare themselves and address future inequalities in digital societies. So a question to reflect on when we all leave this webinar today and go back home and continue our work with digital inclusion could be, is the impact of new technologies on inequality something you discuss in your countries? We don't need you to answer the question right now, but it could be an interesting question to consider in the work in the future.
Yeah, good morning. I guess it's my turn, Louise. So before we present the overall findings of our work, I think it would be essential to say that even though the following will sound as a generalization across the Nordic Baltic region, it's also important to acknowledge significant differences across the countries and areas when it comes to general maturity level of digitalization and focus on digital inclusion. But so what can we conclude about DESI and the Nordic Baltic region? DESI primarily includes data on the digital access barrier, including connectivity and digital public services, and to a lesser degree include digital capabilities. DESI does not include data on level of digital exclusion and citizens group at risks. So while DESI does offer insights on aspects of digital inclusion, it does not provide a full picture as we see it. And here it's of course we should not forget that it has never been an explicit aim of DESI to monitor digital inclusion. And when we look at the region, the Nordic Baltic region has a fragmented approach to monitoring of digital inclusion, also focusing mostly on the digital access aspect. And what we can conclude is that this hinders the ability to learn from and improve policy initiatives. And the last thing we've seen overall is that the Nordic Baltic region demonstrates a strong strategic commitment to digital inclusion at policy level. However, there is a gap exists between the country's policy objectives, you could say, and the implementation of corresponding monitoring practices. So in the discussion paper, we have, based on the overall findings, defined 6 arguments on why Nordic Baltic region should establish a more comprehensive and common monitoring of digital inclusion. The first argument we call need for enhancing monitoring, and argues for closing the mentioned gap between the strong focus on policy strategies in the region and the lack of monitoring the objectives. The second argument we call addressing digital exclusion, and argues for establishing monitoring that provides knowledge about level of digital exclusion, including data on citizens at risk. Thus, not only monitoring digital access and capabilities. The third argument we call lessons from DESI, and argues for learning from DESI and its structured approach for collecting data and its governance. The fourth argument we call importance of collaboration and learning, and argues that a common approach to monitoring in the region will lead to knowledge sharing and thus improved results. The fifth argument we call enhancing DESI for a broader European learning, and argues for a common approach from the Nordic Baltic region, advocating for adjusting DESI to monitor explicitly on digital inclusion. The last and sixth argument we call algorithm for inequities in the digital underclass, and relates to what Louise presented just earlier about new tech and the risk of digital exclusion. So again, based on these arguments, we have developed 3 overall recommendations for the future of monitoring digital inclusion in the Nordic Baltic region. The first recommendation is about unified definition and consistent monitoring. This includes first, a common definition of digital inclusion is needed for a common understanding across the region. Second, regular, persistent and detailed monitoring going beyond digital access and digital capabilities should be established. This will result, we believe, in a monitoring and data gathering that shows progress in the area of digital inclusion. The second recommendation is about monitoring efforts and effects. This includes start monitoring the effects of policy efforts and initiatives related to digital inclusion across the region. This will support the idea of developing and implementing policy efforts based on evidence about what is working in practice. And I think I will give the floor back to you, Louise.
Thank you. And I'd just like to tell you about our third and last recommendation that is about collaboration and learning. And we say that continuous collaboration at the level of the Nordic Baltic region with academic institutions, think tanks, and experts is essential to enable integration of the latest research methodologies and advancements, thereby maintaining an environment for ongoing learning and conceptual development in the field of digital inclusion. Such cooperation could be facilitated at the level of the Nordic Council of Ministers and its related institutions. And we include in this recommendation because we believe that digital inclusion is a field that attracts more and more attention. And we believe that there will be more and more research in this important agenda, and which is very good. And it's crucial for governments to be aware of the latest knowledge and be able to utilize it. So the Nordic Council of Ministers and Nordregio as well could play an important role actually in this work. So our last slide is about two paths to move forward that we have identified and would recommend. And the discussion paper recommends two main paths for advancing monitoring of digital inclusion. One is closer cooperation between the Nordic Baltic countries and regions should be pursued, as it offers greater short-term benefits. That approach could involve creating or defining a dedicated Nordic Baltic digital inclusion cooperation model to oversee consistent monitoring practices and promote knowledge exchange. And the other path would be in the long term, working towards closer cooperation with the EU system within the framework of DESI. Is advisable to incorporate digital inclusion monitoring practices and gain the advantages of a larger knowledge base for comparisons and learning. So our recommendation is basically to pursue both tracks actually, but at different paces. First, the closer Nordic-Baltic cooperation, followed by focusing on the European level. So that was all from us at this point. And thank you very much for your time. And we're looking forward to hopefully answering some of your very good questions. So back to you, Sigrid and Maja.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lasse and Louise. It was really interesting to hear about. Then I think Maja will take charge from here on.
Yes. So I have one question to Digital Europe. If you had to give one advice to the countries in the Nordic and Baltic region regarding monitoring practices, what would it then be?
Maybe I can start. Lasse, you can just add.
Sure.
I think that based on this work, well, we have a lot of interesting recommendations, but maybe the most important one might be to keep the collaboration and the work between the Nordic and Baltic countries close and working closely together on monitoring and to institutionalize monitoring more systematically. And in addition to this, we could recommend beginning to analyze and monitor the effects of the political initiatives that are being launched in different countries in order to be able to learn more from each other. Yeah?
Sounds good.
Good.
Yes. And then we have another question from the chat to also Digital Europe. Regarding monitoring, how do we include the voices of the citizens themselves on how they perceive their situation, possible barriers to inclusion, and so on?
Go ahead, Louise, if you want.
Yeah.
I know it's your area.
Well, I think basically we have to keep on asking them. We need to ask people what are the problems that you're facing in your everyday life when it comes to using digital solutions from the public sector. So large surveys, ongoing surveys, because things change all the time. Our use of technology changes from the public side, and also the skills and capabilities from citizens change over time. So it's not a one-timer. You have to do this over and over again to follow the development of use of the public sector digital services. And then actually also keeping people very close when you are developing new technology. Testing it on different kinds of people with different kinds of challenges over and over again, so that you know and you're not guessing. You know actually what are the challenges that people meet when using this digital service that we have developed.
And maybe just to add a little thing, Louisa, I think this directly relates to the recommendation that we have of starting to measure the level of digital exclusion, and not only the access barriers or the capability barriers. And of course, how do you do that? I mean, as Louisa said, it's about engaging with citizens, big surveys, engaging with maybe interest organizations, representing those group of people.
Can I just say something, Maja?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I just saw another question coming up in the chat that said, what is the main goal? When are people included, or something like that? That is actually a very good question. So maybe I could just add a few words on that, because when are we there? That's a really good question. Is this ever going to end? No, it's not. I don't believe so. I think this is a challenge that we must keep working on, like forever, because technologies are developing all the time. There's also always a group of elderly people maybe finding it difficult to use technology. 20 years from now, I'm one of them. So please don't forget to make us all included. So the main goal might be a society where we can all participate equally in society, and we can all benefit from technology. That is very ambitious, but that must be the goal.
I can maybe also just add to that and say that if we look at the policy reports right now, or the policy strategies right now, it's also clear that there isn't, at least compared to previous policies, that there is to a larger extent also acknowledgement that not all can necessarily participate digitally, and not necessarily meaning that they have to then. That there's also more and more focused on power of attorney solutions, and other solutions where you can actually be digitally exempt for participating in the digital life. So I think also that's an important, at least, development in the focus that we are seeing right now, that we're also moving beyond the demand that all should be able to participate digitally, and also acknowledging that we in the future also need to provide solutions where with both, of course, to make sure that it is more easy to be digitally included, but also to acknowledge that some people might not ever come to the stage where they can be digitally included, and we need to also incorporate and include them in the development, and so they can be part of society as well.
And a related question on this is directed to you, Sigrid. What is the most prevalent definition of digital inclusion that you found?
It is also one of the findings is that there's very few definitions actually, that they at least concrete definitions. One exemption of this is Norway, who in most of the digital inclusion policies and also overall digitalization policies are going beyond, and they're actually also taking point of departure in a Norwegian scholar called Midgaard, I think, with my Danish pronunciation. I'm probably butchering the name, but it's at least it is one of the more concrete definitions, where it's both taking point of departure in overall digital accessibility, but also different digital capabilities. And now I can't remember the exact definition, but we have it in the report as well. But overall, while there's very limited concrete definitions, we can see that indirectly the way that the different policies at least are approaching the topic of digital inclusion, while we will not be able to quote them and say that this is the definition of digital inclusion, we can maybe have a discussion that some of the themes that keeps coming up is basic rights, the right to participate in society, both digitally but also non-digitally, the development of skills overall in society, but also the topic of accessibilities from the service providers, that we need to talk about how to define, how to create solutions where people have an easier time to at least participate. So while there might not be concrete definitions, the way that they approach the topic and also identified barriers and problems overall in society, I would argue that there is at least an understanding and approach that is similar in the region.
All right. And then we got a really interesting question as well from the chat to all of you guys, I think. I would like to hear your thoughts on a balance of Nordic Baltic countries leading the way in this area and creating initiatives for digital inclusion versus awaiting joint EU decisions and guidelines.
Do you want to start? Lasse and Louise, or should...
Just go ahead, yeah.
I think it's a really good question. It's also a quite complex question. So this is also coming from me as a person and not necessarily as a representative. But I think it needs to be both, if it makes sense. I think it can quickly also, we need to acknowledge that we in this part of the world, we are highly digitalized. So we also having the opportunity to be front movers in the sense of trying to incorporate a social and digital inclusion perspective early on. But that also being said, I think that this is an effort that where we need to also collaborate across the Nordic and Baltic region, but it's also something where we need to also not take for granted the European level, because a lot of things are also going on in the European level. It might be a bit more top down, at least at this stage, but at least there's also things going on. So I think it can quickly get a bit too biased if we are not acknowledging also the trends and tendencies that's going on at the European level.
And maybe also the point that in the Nordic Baltic countries, many of these countries are ambitious when it comes to digitalization, just as you said, Sigrid, and we've come far with this work, and maybe we should also think of the collaboration with the EU level as a way or an opportunity to influence some of the work coming from there, because we have experiences in our part of Europe that maybe the rest of Europe would like to learn from, or not learn from, but get inspired from, or something. So, well, I think it's really important to work closely together on both areas.
I agree. Can I quickly, just because I saw that there was maybe a more Christian clarification question regarding the policy report. So sorry for,
No.
but it's there was a question whether the policies were regarding digitalization strategies or digital inclusion strategies, and there's of course a difference. And just to clarify this, some of these strategies may be like. We can look a bit more exactly into it, but approximately half of these strategies are directly targeted, or at least I think even more, are directly targeting digital inclusion. It's the main topic. Then there's different aspects of digital inclusion that's been touched upon, going from electronic IDs to labor market participation and so on. But it is the main focus of most of these strategies is policies at the national level regarding digital inclusion. Then there's also some of the more broader national digitalization strategies that there are some of the documents that are very, very comprehensive, where it's a subsection, where it's not necessarily the main focus, but it is a subsection. So both is involved here, and I would say the majority is actually digital inclusion strategies, which again is going back to my point with like, it is quite impressive actually in 2 years that we see such a big increase. Yeah, it was just to clarify, but sorry for...
Yeah. Perfect. Good. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. And we got one stating or asking how to ensure that digital inclusion does not imply involuntary data collection from citizens.
That's a good question. I like that one.
Yeah, me too.
But I'm not able to answer that question. I think it's a very big question.
Yeah.
So, and basically, it's almost a religious question. Who owns the data? Is that the ownership of the citizen or the individual, or is it the public sector's data? People could argue about that question for days. Well, in my opinion, the most important part would be to be very clear to the citizen on what kinds of data are we collecting here, and what's the purpose of collecting them? What are we using them for? And then be specific about that, so that the individual will be able to feel safe about that. I think that's the most important thing to say about that.
Yeah, agreed, Louise. It's a long one.
Yeah.
It's also
a complex discussion.
It is, and it's also touching upon some of the more ethical considerations that we might not necessarily touch upon to the extent that we should. That there is both a data privacy element of it, but there's of course also just the objective that the more data, the better solutions or evidence-based solution we can actually create. So it is a discussion that of course needs to be taken on while also conducting the work in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. Okay, do we have time for one more question? Or
A quick one, yeah.
okay, probably not.
Or maybe
because this is a big question.
There's also if we didn't manage to answer all the questions, you're more than welcome to reach out. We will send email addresses afterwards. So please reach out if there's any questions that you are dying to answer to get answered and we didn't have the time to respond to.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. What role or roles can and should the Nordics take here in terms of the Nordic cooperation?
I think it's a Louise question.
Yes. The Nordics meaning people or countries?
I assume countries in that sense. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think the most important answer to that question would be to please be careful not to reinvent the wheel over and over again in every country. So please work closely together on sharing experiences, sharing knowledge about the effect of your initiatives. I think that's the most important answer from me. Work closely together, monitor the situation in your country, and also start monitoring the effect of your initiatives. Most of you aren't doing that today, but that is really important. It's extremely difficult, and that's probably why not many countries are doing it. But I think it's extremely important to move forward in that direction, monitoring effects of initiatives on digital inclusion and start sharing them.
Which is also, we can see in several of the policies right now that they are either already starting to do so or they are mentoring plans or ambitions to do so, to measure the impact of engagement.
That's good to hear.
Just to add briefly, I can see in the chat that by Nordics, they also meant maybe the Nordic Council and Nordic Council of Ministers. And I would just add to that, I mean, in my view, my personal view, I think it's an opportunity for the Nordic Council of Ministers to take a mandate and try to coordinate this work across the Nordic Baltic region.
Perfect. I think with these concluding points, I will maybe say thank you for all the great questions and then move on to a brief wrap up. Because while this was the first launch of the Digital Inclusion in Action project, several more outputs are on the way. So if you're interested in, for example, the role of civil society actors regarding digital inclusion in Nordic and Baltic region, our upcoming fieldwork on electronic ID rollout in Greenland, Faroe Islands, and Åland, the role of the private sector in digital skills training, tools, digital services for digital accessibilities, or our upcoming conceptual framework for digital inclusion in the conceptual framework for indicator mapping regarding digital inclusion in Nordic and Baltic countries, please check out our platform, our Nordic and Baltic DigiHub, which you soon will get the link to in the chat. More events and more information will be uploaded during the span of the next couple of months regarding the outcomes of this project. And then finally, also love to just say, please save the date and join us in Stockholm at the 14th and 15th of May this year, where we will have a conference, have our grand conference regarding digital inclusion in the Nordic and Baltic region. More information will follow very soon, and we hope to see as many of you as possible in this sense. So please save the date, the 14th and 15th of May. And with this, I would like to say thank you so much for great questions and joining us today at January, in Stockholm at least, very gray January morning. It was great to see so many of you and that you are so engaged. We're very thankful for that. So please stay in contact, and we will see you at the next events. Thank you so much.